Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true first-hand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. For many of us, the realm of psychedelic medicines has served as a catalyst for deeper spiritual connection. Whether we originally connected with these medicines for this reason, or this awareness came forth at a later date, it's no secret that within this realm lies the potential for this opportunity to connect us deeper to who and what we truly are as divine beings having a human experience. The main challenge that presents itself, however, within the lives of many spiritual seekers that connect with psychedelic medicines for increased connection to the realm of spirit, is a lack of both understanding of the nature of reality and also how to integrate this ability to connect deeper to spirit into their everyday lives. Today's guest on the show is a man I am beyond excited to speak to regarding not only his personal experiences with these medicines, but also the ways in which he has embodied and integrated this understanding of the nature of reality into his own life and the lives of his students. He is a paradigm-shifting spiritual teacher that delivers a fresh, new perspective of self-realization through his teachings on the law of one, non-duality, and spiritual intelligence. And his mission is to provide humanity with the tools, knowledge, and the practical application needed to aid our collective ascent into enlightenment or fourth density consciousness. His main vehicle from which he delivers these teachings and empowers his students through is his business, 4D University. And trust me when I say that for any of you who resonate with his message, I highly recommend checking out his content and offerings and seeing for yourself why he's been able to shift so many people's mindsets within the work he has devoted himself to. So please help me in welcoming my man, Aaron Abke, to the show. Aaron, what's up, bro?
Hey, man. So happy to be with you and been looking forward to getting a chance to drop in together. So this will be fun.
For all the listeners, this episode almost never happened. I don't know if I ever would have hit record, like we were just chatting so much before we hit record.
We already did a podcast.
I know, literally. This is what happens when two projectors get together. I was like, oh shit, I got to hit record on this eventually. So
we're already on hour 2, man.
Exactly. Well, man.
You finally welcomed me after 2 hours.
Literally. And I'm so glad that it happened that way because it's such a positive sign, right? Like, and the listeners know, like, I nerd out, like the people I get on, like I'm genuinely very interested in chatting with. And, for you specifically, man, like, when you run like a similar thing, like I have a community, right? And people hit me up like, I don't know why I just resonated super hard. I don't even use cannabis, or maybe I do, but I don't necessarily believe what you're saying, but I just resonate, right? With you, it's very similar, right? When I first saw you, obviously, like I'm aware of the law of one. We're going to get a little bit deeper into that for people that may not be aware of it. I'm aware of 4D consciousness, but there was just something where I was like, the way this guy says it, I resonate with so fucking highly because
that's a great compliment.
Dude, it was, you're very welcome, dude. Like you deserve it because to take these kind of concepts and be able to articulate them in ways that even anyone could be like, oh, I understand that, right? Whether they agree with it, not agree with it, whatever, they understand it and understand it is powerful, And I'm curious for you, like, just to kind of start this off, I kind of start off a lot of these shows in a very similar way because it creates great context, which is, how did you first become interested in, let's kind of expand it, because I know I've heard part of your story before. So, you can give us whatever parts you'd like to, but how'd you get interested in psychedelics, but also spirituality? Because as I said in the intro, for everyone listening, I'm going to position this episode. Of course, we'll talk about psychedelics, but for a lot of you, you hit me up and you're like, how do I integrate this, right? And so I want to show you someone other than me and other than some of the guests we've had on that truly embody like practicing what they preach and also connecting with these medicines, So how did you first become interested in the topic of psychedelics, spirituality? You can take it any way you want, as long or short of an explanation.
Great. It'll probably be a longer one because I'll get into a bit of my backstory. We'll kill two birds with one
Get two birds stoned at once.
Even better. We'll get two birds stoned at once. I got a firsthand direct experience almost immediately upon trying psychedelics, or let's say cannabis. Cannabis was the first plant medicine I ever tried, and I was 26 when I first experienced cannabis. And I got a firsthand experience just shortly after that of what a spiritual enhancer that cannabis can be. And so, to make a long story short, I grew up as a pastor's kid, devout Christian, wanted to follow in my dad's footsteps as a pastor, did that, graduated from ORU, Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, with a sort of like double bachelor's in music and theology, because I wanted to be a pastor. So I was going to start off as a worship pastor, which I did at 23, and then eventually move into a senior pastor role like my dad. And that was my life's plan until I started questioning a lot of the kind of dogmatic beliefs of Christianity, and my religion just kind of unraveled over a period of about 5 years. I started asking questions around 18, being like, hey, some of this doesn't make sense to me, and getting a lot of pushback, which only kind of just makes the problem worse when you're questioning. And then 5 years later, at 23, I was finally like, I can't handle this internal conflict anymore. I don't know who this God is you people talk about. I don't know who this Jesus is you talk about. The God revealed in Jesus that I see and know and experience is a God of love, forgiveness, compassion, and infinite mercy. So I reject your Christian God of torture and vengeance and retribution and judgment. And I left my religion, moved back to Oklahoma where I'd gone to college. I had just gotten married at 23. And then that led to a divorce about 3 years later as our paths kind of diverged after I left religion. And then I moved back in with my parents in the Bay Area, started working as a personal trainer. Fitness was kind of my only life at that point, because up to that point, being a Christian was my life and I wanted to be a pastor. So you have your whole plan of action for your life, your whole sense of purpose ripped out from under you. And it's like, now who are you without being a Christian? And I didn't know who I was. And so I wanted to find myself and find, what do I believe about God and the divine? And so I did some intense seeking in the Eastern traditions, especially Hinduism and probably secondly Buddhism, and was just seeking enlightenment teachings, because this one teaching that there is a heavenly state of consciousness. Maybe it's not a place we go when we die, but heaven is a state of consciousness was acceptable to me. And so I wanted to know, how do I access that state? And after getting divorced, leaving religion, living in the Bay Area, you can't really have friends. If you're from the Bay Area, you know this very well. It's just a tech job environment where it's like everyone's in their little bubble world and rushing 100 miles an hour through life to get to and from their Google job or something. And so you don't really have a chance to have a social life. And even if you want to have one, you got to drive 2 hours through traffic to get anywhere to do anything. So I just spent all my time alone in my apartment and being depressed and lonely. Post-divorce, all my friends and family rejected me as a heretic. To this day, none of them, want to have any communication with me. So I was all alone with my suffering, without any real sense of purpose in life. I didn't know what I believed anymore. So you better believe that started a really vicious, dark night of the soul. And I went through that process of shadow work. And really it was just this horrendous, crippling depression of like, I don't want to live another day like this. What's the purpose? What's the point? Why keep going on? And what I like to say is what rescued me from that depression eventually after my awakening was that I realized no one is depressed because life has no purpose. They think that's why they're depressed, but we really are depressed because life has so much purpose and beauty and meaning that to miss out on it is like death, is the worst thing ever. All this purpose and divine sacredness and beauty and wonders all around us, and we can't see it, can't experience it, can't connect with it. Kill me, get me out of here. That's really what depression is. So you have to find your purpose. And then all of a sudden you realize just how worth living and how beautiful and sacred this life really is. And that's happiness. So that led me to this spiritual awakening experience at 27, I believe, where I was working as a personal trainer at Google full time. And I would go up to this balcony above my gym and meditate or listen to an Eckhart Tolle lecture. And it was the one time of the day where I felt like I had some peace of mind. And so I got up there one day after, at least 3 months or so of doing this. And I was listening to a certain Eckhart Tolle lecture where he was kind of mimicking things that our egos say to us and then kind of making light of them. And then the audience would laugh and he would laugh. So I started chuckling with this audio tape I'm listening to because I started to recognize the humor in it, that like, wow, he's dead on, man. That's exactly what my ego says to me every day. And then I started thinking like, wow, it's hilarious. It's like we all have the same voice in our head. And that's when, laughter can be a really powerful way to realize something. And I just kind of laughed myself into that realization that, yes, in fact, we do have the same voice in our head. We all suffer from the same delusion, which is ego, separation. And so I realized in one instant, oh, I'm not that voice in my head that is depressed and wants to commit suicide and is suffering. That's not who I am. That's just thoughts. And I'm the awareness behind those thoughts. All of that was just very clear and childlike for me. And then, of course, the vision of that within yourself creates the external vision of it in the terms of oneness, where you realize, oh, it's all just one consciousness, one energy knowing itself. And it's this unspeakably beautiful realization. Mm-hmm. And so from that point on, I had 2 weeks, 14 days exactly, in that state, unbroken, without a single lapse in my bliss consciousness, just bliss and peace all the time, love overflowing, so much inner silence and just such a quiet, beautiful mind. And I woke up in that state on the 14th day, and I woke up to my alarm, looked at the date, and my mind realized it was the next Monday, 2 Mondays later. I was like, oh, it's been 2 full weeks that I've been in this heavenly state. And then I had the first ego thought kind of come back online, which was, I wonder if I'm enlightened. Maybe this is it, right? Maybe I am enlightened now. And I didn't catch that was the ego coming back. And so that began to unravel that state from the 14-day mark on. And I started to slowly feel that state slipping away as I noticed myself suffering a little bit. One of the first things I noticed, it might have been that same day, I think it probably was, is that I was training a client and I looked up at the clock to see what time it was and how much time I had left. And that was always something I did before that experience. I couldn't wait to get every session over with so I could go have a break or go eat or do the next thing, right? And so when I looked at the clock, I noticed that I looked at the clock and I was like, oh no, I didn't do that for the last 2 weeks. I didn't even think about doing that for the last 2 weeks. I was so viscerally present and happy in the moment. My client had to tell me when the sessions were over. Like, hey man, I don't want to keep you. Like, our session ended 10 minutes ago. I'm like, oh, great. So here's where cannabis comes in. So I noticed that if I smoked cannabis, it would put me right back in that state. And so as the days and weeks went on, I started smoking cannabis more and more because I realized at a certain point I couldn't be in that state without cannabis. But if I got high, it would put me right back in that vision of oneness and inner peace and quiet. And so eventually even the cannabis didn't work. And then the cannabis started to provoke the shadows again. And back I was into the dark night of the soul. But the beauty of that experience was that now I had this totally new perspective on reality, that I actually glimpsed what is available for us and what is possible, which is that enlightenment isn't this super far away state of consciousness that only a rare few can attain. It's just that so few really want it bad enough that they're willing to give up the mundane attachments to worldly pleasures and self-fulfillment and all of that. Self-seeking, right? They're just not willing enough to give up that stuff to have the prize of enlightenment. But it is available to anyone who gives up the personal sense of self and becomes the universal. And cannabis really showed me that, because as the personal came back online, the universal seemed to be obscured by it. But I knew, I'm like, that state didn't go away. It's still in me. I can feel it, but it's now clouded by ego noise and chaos, right? So I've just got to figure out how to back engineer my way back into that state. So I had this absolute conviction that that state exists and is possible. And then I had this undying passion that I'm going to do whatever it takes to get back there. I don't care what I have to give up. I'll lay down any treasure you ask of me. I only want one thing in this life. And so at that point, I literally quit my modeling career. I quit bodybuilding and the show I was training for. I had to keep my training job because that was the only way I had to make money. but I spent all my free time spiritual seeking. And so I went through a challenging relationship with cannabis for a while because it would put me in that yo-yo state. And I realized I was way overly dependent on it. So what cannabis taught me is that it can be a great spiritual enhancement if it's used with intention and authenticity to connect with the divine. It can be a powerful gateway.
Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show.
But it cannot be something you rely upon and become dependent upon, or cannabis will take off the gloves a bit and start slapping you around with your shadows. And it's like, look, man, I'm just here to show you what's possible. I'm here to help you glimpse what's real. But if you only go through me, I'm going to put your shadows in your face eventually, because this is the stuff you got to face if you want to earn that state permanently. To me, cannabis kind of became a teacher like that.
Yeah. I mean, dude, this is perfect. Like, first of all of that is amazing. Like, I could talk for hours on how much that resonates, and I could talk to you about my very similar experience that happened in 2019, which led to me creating Highly Optimized, everything I do now, where I went through a very similar period. I didn't count it specifically, but it was around 2 weeks. It was like a week, 2 weeks, right around there, where I was just in this state. Like, literally, there was so many things that happened that were so funny. I had headaches for every day for a year and a half, just this low level headache. And I always kept my hair back in a ponytail, right? So literally, I come back from this trip, which the trip itself was hilarious. The way this all happened was Rachel and I were at a cannabis convention in Vegas trying to find investors to open a dispensary, put love-grown cannabis on the map. And we didn't find anyone. So we ended up, I asked her what she wanted to do her last night there. She was like, do you want to go to a strip club and maybe connect with some MDMA? And I was like, okay, let's do it. So we had, as funny as it sounds, her and I had never been to a strip club independent of one another or together. So I had no idea what to experience. So we go there, and through this experience, I won't go through the whole thing as the listeners have heard it before, but through the whole experience, I was able to take ownership fully over my state of being and over the situation. And because of that, it just opened up this awareness in me. And I thought it would wear off. I would thought I took MDMA, it's a heart opener, obviously. And it just didn't leave. It just got stronger and stronger and stronger for I would say literally a 2-week period, right around there anyway. And then it started to fade away. It was actually opposite for me. The first realization I got was, you've been numbing your emotions out for so long that you haven't allowed yourself to actually be in the present moment. And you're using cannabis to numb these things out. You got to take a full break for a while. And that's when I went through my 3 months of complete abstinence from everything. Caffeine. I didn't even use nicotine at that point, but everything. Right. And that period was really powerful for me, and, I'm curious for you. I mean, there's so many, areas we can take that, but one of the ways in which I've viewed cannabis, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too, because we basically are speaking a very similar language, is that a lot of people mistake, I'll make it personal, I, for many years, I won't project on anyone else, mistook cannabis as the figurative moon or sun, instead of metaphorically the finger that can point us back to what the true sun is, which might be self-realization, self-actualization, waking up to who and what we truly are, depending on what language you use. But again, a lot of people mistake the finger for the moon or sun, right? So the analogy I give often is, it's almost as if, say you have a business goal, and so you hire a business coach. And so this business coach and you meet, and this business coach leaves you with clear action items that you're going to go through before you're meeting with him or her next time, right? So you come back to this meeting, let's say a week later, and they're like, how'd you do? And you're like, what do you mean? I didn't do anything. I'm just here to worship you. And they're like, what? You're here to learn stuff so you can go do it. That's the entire challenge I've seen within the cannabis space. And again, it's multifaceted. If you blow that out into even the term recreational, language is super important, albeit, it goes very deep. But yeah, it's very interesting, especially spending a lot of time on the inside in the industry. That's why I had to leave. Because once I realized this, and once I realized that, like, hey, like for me, I was connecting with it every night and I was unconscious, but I was still eating healthy. I was still sleeping. I was still doing the basics. Once I really like accepted where most people are at, and not like, I didn't have any shame or guilt around like, oh, I'm giving them the cannabis they're numbing out with, but it was just a lot of darkness that I was around each day. And I discerned that for me personally, I was like, I don't want to be around this anymore, So it's very interesting how those moments where you can go through those dark nights of the soul call you forward. I mean, we hear it all the time, but it's a different thing to actually have experienced it, So I love you going into all that.
Yeah, it's such a great catalyst for self-awareness in the way that you form your relationship to it, because it will bring out any addictive tendencies you have, or if you're trying to bypass something or escape something, cannabis will attract you for for those reasons. So you've got to be self-honest, and like all the things you're just reflecting on. Am I really using this to avoid something, or am I using it intentionally to connect? And that's how my relationship has kind of wound up with it, is that I do still love it as a connection device or an amplification device. One thing that became clear to me since 26, now 34, so 8 years of experiencing cannabis use, is that it's clearly an accelerator of prana. It accelerates the rate at which your body's using prana. And that's why you get dry mouth, your bladder gets really full really quick. You notice how much faster water is moving through the system. And water is like the conduit for energy being carried through the body. That's why like 80% of your body is water. If your water intake is increasing, your prana intake is increasing. And that's why you get access to these higher frequencies of consciousness much easier, because your energy levels, your output literally is increasing. I bet you, even if we could see and measure the biofield, the toroidal field that comes down around the crown and up through the root, I guarantee you we could measure it, actually see it visually on a map, increasing a bit, expanding a bit. Your frequency increases when you take any plant medicine. And that's why there's a bit of a risk reward, right? Because you accelerated your use for a while, you're going to have a bit of a dip afterwards as your body recovers back to natural levels. You see this way more so with like mushrooms and ayahuasca and whatnot, which are even more extreme amplifiers of prana than cannabis is. But so for me, I like to use cannabis if I want to get into a deep writing flow and let the creativity really start flowing and get into that zone. And for a while, I would feel guilty, moderately, mildly, but feel guilty for using cannabis to write or something. And then I started realizing all the other things I would do to optimize my body and nervous system to get into a good state to write. I want to make sure I get good sleep. So like if I didn't get good sleep, I'll take a quick nap before I go write. I'll make sure I take my nootropics, or I'm really well hydrated, on and on and on. And it's like, why do I not feel guilty for taking the nap, taking the nootropics, all the other things I mentioned? It's because we have this taboo association with cannabis as a drug. And there's been so much indoctrination in our culture and labeling around drugs are bad, war on drugs, dare, don't do drugs. And so when cannabis gets labeled a drug, which it really isn't in the sense of a chemical created, lab created compound, we naturally associate it with like all other kinds of drugs, cocaine, alcohol, and we associate that with addiction and stuff. So you see all the labels that we've created around, especially plant medicines, tabooizing everything to death, makes it so that we can't even give ourselves permission to use it in a super healthy way, right? Why wouldn't it be healthy if we know that cannabis is a tool, like a nap is a tool, like water is a tool, like a nootropic herbal supplement's a tool? It's just a tool. And that tool increases the flow of prana in your body temporarily. And then you feel a lull afterwards as your prana needs to recover. So that's when you get sleepy and usually want to go to bed. It's like you can use it as it works in reality and as it was designed by the logos to work, and use it accordingly. And I think that's exactly how and why it was designed by the logos, because why else would the logos have put that plant here with that kind of functionality? Everything has a unique purpose. And so to use cannabis for what it's best at, not using it to avoid, to bypass, to have an addiction to something, to be able to be comfortable in a social setting. These are common ways that cannabis is abused, But that certainly doesn't mean that any usage of cannabis isn't validated in some way. I think we just have to reframe it. And that really starts with taking all the labels off, of untabooizing cannabis and just saying it's a tool like everything's a tool. The only question is, how are you going to use it?
Exactly. It's like, I mean, you hit it nail on the head. Like, the biggest thing that I get to help my clients with is shame and guilt, and I remind them that, like, even though you might, there's not one aspect. I think it's everything, right? It's like, you can't say, oh, it's just the government, right? Because it's also like your friends and family that were influenced also by the government, right? Like all these things, right? It's all multifaceted. But if we look into, like, let's say just the government, what I remind people of often is that even though the government has classified cannabis as a Schedule 1 drug, which in its definition means no medicinal value, the government also has
crazy.
It's so ridiculous. The government also holds patent 6650307, if I remember correctly. I don't know if I got that right, but basically it's a...
Wow, the patent number.
Yeah, the patent number. Exactly.
Impressive.
Dude, it's funny. I just taught a class on that recently, and I think it's 6650307. I'm pretty sure. For some reason, license plates and phone numbers are like easier, so that's like one of those. It looks like one of those, but they hold a patent of cannabis being a neuroprotectant for conditions like lupus and things like that. So it's just like, when you really look into it, it's easy enough to see, like, oh, we've been programmed. And that's one of the challenges, is what I get a lot from people is, show me the science. I'm like, oh, you mean the science that you just saw based on that patent thing has been bought out by the pharmaceutical cartels in this country? And if you go look at the research that's been coming out of Israel, it says very different things than a lot of the newest research coming out of here, right? And I'm not a scientist necessarily, so I'm not going to say that I know the answer, but I will put it this way, right? We've been told a lot of things about cannabis. You and I are talking here right now as cannabis enthusiasts. We're able to be articulated. We're able to, run our own businesses. We're able to be on podcasts. And again, that's all based on self-responsibility, right? And that's like my big mission with cannabis, is just telling people, like, you're looking at the wrong place. I get that you're upset that your life might not be ending up the way you want it to, or that someone that you love's life is not ending up where you would like it to see, or where their potential would go. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? The same way that you wouldn't say it's, oh, someone drinks water every day and they crash their car, so water must cause drunk driving. It's like, no, there must be something else going on, right? So, one of the first things we learn in psychology is correlation doesn't equal causation. And so I think one of the biggest, like, time hops we're going to require as a society around cannabis is something that really is much bigger than just cannabis. It's taking radical responsibility over your own state of being, right? Not blaming cannabis for why you're lazy or why you're anxious or why you're paranoid, really just like realizing that how you do anything is how you do everything. So if you're doing that with cannabis,
I was just going to say that
it's like you're doing it everywhere. And so that's where, like, as a microcosm, I really enjoy cannabis, because all of your potential addictive patterns and all your things are going to be magnified and amplified. Exactly like you said, cannabis works very similar to other plant medicines as a mirror, right? It's going to mirror back your internal state of reality. And so there's a great opportunity there if you choose to believe you're the hero of your own story, and that this plant is aiding you in living your best life. And that doesn't happen by just consuming the plant. It happens by taking the awareness and then going on the hero's journey, right? Metaphorically and figuratively, And so again, like, if you're consuming the plant and you're unaware and you're blaming the plant, well, hey, I'm not going to say you're wrong or anything, but how is that going for you? Because I know when I used to do that, it didn't lead me to any sense of empowerment. And that wasn't the plant's fault, wasn't the world's fault, wasn't the government's fault. It was ultimately my responsibility, right? And it can sound harsh. And this is what I always tell people, like, it sounds harsh for all of like 5 minutes until you really actually understand what taking full responsibility means. It means, like, it's kind of like in Home Alone where he says, I made my family disappear. I made my family disappear. It's like, that's the cognitive shift. So I love bringing that up.
That's such a great example, dude.
But yeah, man, it's interesting stuff, and I'm curious for you, man. Like, I love diving into this stuff because I'm genuinely curious. I learn new stuff about cannabis all the time. Like, one of the things that I've been curious on, and with your spiritual background, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I think I've already heard mostly what, I imagine you're going to say, but I'd like to dive in. Like, let's just say some of the organizations that I've been a spiritual seeker for a long time, and I've gotten myself into a lot of different things, and I've enjoyed a lot of it. I never throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? But But a lot of the things people say are just ridiculous. I was a part of this organization that tried to tell me that cocaine was better for my energetic body than cannabis, and that cannabis was going to steal my soul.
Man, that's so crazy.
I know. And I was like, man, I tried to tell him, I was like, listen, if you don't agree with cannabis, just say you don't agree with it. Like, things like that are almost so outlandish these days that you're going to lose a lot of people if that's like your opening argument. You know?
And how could you possibly really know that?
Exactly.
That's just your opinion.
Exactly. And then you
can say it's my opinion that.
Yeah.
But don't you go tell people this is a fact and you should believe this.
Exactly. Because like my whole thing too, and I was curious, this is like, the part that I'm really curious about is if you're in alignment with me, which I imagine you probably are in alignment with something very similar, if not the same belief. But if God, source, whatever we want to call it, I don't mind the term God, so I use God. If God created everything, right? How could something natural like cannabis be all of a sudden something that, oh, we're not supposed to do that, though? It kind of brings us back to the whole Garden of Eden thing, like this trickster God that, is really being projected on human emotion, right? Like these are human tendencies, right? I'm going to tell them not to do that, right? But I know they're going to do it, and then I'm going to trick them, right? And we can go into...
I'm going to make it the best freaking plant medicine ever, and then make it wrong for them to do it.
Steal their soul, Like, it's just ridiculous. So I'm curious, like, have you heard...
It's going to steal their soul.
Exactly, and you got to do this thing when you do it too, But I'm curious, like, have you, of course, being raised as a preacher and all, or pastor and all of these things, like, I'm sure you heard some of these things as well, right? And I'd love to have you speak to some of the things you've heard that, again, like, guys, like, I'm sure Aaron and I don't have all the answers objectively, if that even is a thing, but I know for me, it really helped to have people that are experts in their respective fields speak about how they've been able to, of course, consume cannabis, even though they were tried to be programmed in all these ways. So I'd love if you could speak to that, just like any dogma you found in different, either religions, spiritual practices, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason I was laughing so hard is because it reminds me so much of the religious God that I disavowed at 23. We see that fundamentalist view of the divine is not just exclusive to religion, but it shows up even in, New Age spirituality and all kinds of different circles and even other religions. So it really goes back to what you said, the point about the self-responsibility, in that the way you are with one thing is the way you are with everything. Often people will say, I'll hear people say, I don't like cannabis because it gives me anxiety. Or I don't like cannabis because it makes me nervous. And I say, no, it doesn't make you anything. It shows you that you have anxiety. And it shows you that you are nervous. It just brings those things to the surface where normally they're a little more hidden from you. So in that way, you can use cannabis, and I've used cannabis like this for years, as a powerful amplification device for your consciousness. If you're like, hey, I feel today like there's some darkness in here. And if you're like a very adept shadow worker and you've mastered the ability to sit with pain, I'll literally light up a volcano bag of cannabis and tobacco to be like, let's get this thing up. Let's really feel this. Let's move this energy. And then boom, off it goes. And the disturbing thoughts start to pick up. I'm like, that's what I wanted. Thank you. And I just bring that part of me in and accept it as valid. And your fears are valid. Your sadness is valid. Your anger is valid. You're accepted. You're okay. It's not wrong to feel these things. So cannabis, for one person, that causes them to reject themselves and not want to do cannabis for that reason. On the same end, cannabis helps me to accept myself more in that very same response, only because I'm using it differently than they're using it. And why do I use cannabis as a aid for spiritual growth? Because I do that with everything, right? The way you are with one thing is the way you are with everything. I use my diet for that. The only real reason I eat healthy like this is because of my spirituality. I was a fitness model before, a bodybuilder. I had an incredible physique, and I ate like garbage back then because I didn't really care enough about my body. I wasn't really in a loving relationship with my body. I just wanted to use it for my own pleasure and fulfillment. So the fact that I looked jacked and shredded was all I cared about. I didn't care about my toxic load or my liver enzymes or any of those health markers. They were irrelevant to me back then. So now, like, I'm not willing to sacrifice my health for almost anything. Of course, there are things I would if it came to that. But like, as a principle, I am in loving relationship to everything. That's my spiritual practice. Be in loving relationships everywhere. Be in a loving relationship to your own mind and your thoughts. be in a loving relationship to your emotions and the things you feel, be in a loving relationship to the people in your life, but most of all, be in loving relationship to yourself, to your body, because your body is what gives you the ability to have experience, right? And if you're at this super low frequency because you're loaded up with microplastics and endocrine disruptors and GMOs and pesticides and alcohol and white sugar, you better believe spiritual growth is going to feel impossible for you because you're basically doing everything you can to slow that process down. Whereas if you, on the same end, expand your body's frequency by making it, allowing it to be in a state of health and wholeness, oh boy, do you see how much easier spiritual progress is with a healthy, fit body. It's just a night and day difference. And so I don't care why it's that way. It just is that way, right? And all I care about is spiritual progress. And so if I know that a healthy body will contribute to that, I'm going to be healthy. And likewise, if I know that exercising helps with that, I'm going to exercise. Being kind to people, I'm going to be kind. Serving others, I'm going to serve others. And if cannabis can connect me to the divine in unique ways, can amplify my practice of shadow work, can amplify my meditative state, and all these other things, why would I not use it for those purposes? Of course I would. It's no less valid than any of the other things I just mentioned, right? And that's the taking the labels off, I think, that we need to do with not just cannabis, but with everything. But with cannabis, especially if that's where you struggle, it's like, what if you just didn't make it wrong in any way and you just saw it like everything else? You don't think food is wrong. You don't feel guilty every time you eat anything. But if you're eating really, really bad food all the time, you will start to feel guilty. Why? Because you're misusing food. So what about cannabis? Why don't you just use cannabis as it was intended by God to be used? It is a plant medicine. So there's absolutely valid reasons for using it. If your intention's there and if your consciousness is there, beautiful things will happen. And that's why I think also plant medicines in general, psychedelics, ayahuasca, psilocybin, MDMA, these are true miracles. As Terence McKenna said, they're the only miracles in town in a way, because there is nothing else that can replicate the experience of the psychedelic experience, right? Of taking 3.5 grams of mushrooms. I wouldn't say this as direction to somebody, but I do believe that it's probably in everyone's benefit to do 3.5 grams of mushrooms at least once in your life, because whether it brings up all your shadows and shows you what's in there that needs to be met with love, or if it gives you experiences of the divine that you could never have had soberly, either way, it's a humongous benefit to your spiritual growth. And so, yes, people abuse mushrooms and plant medicines and they take them way too often. But does that mean you shouldn't ever take one? Absolutely not. Everything in the universe is about balance. The universe exists in a state of balance, giving and receiving, positive, negative, vibration, right? Everything is vibrating in perfect balance. And so we need to actually find our balance within everything, right? Find your balance within your diet. Find your balance in your romantic life. Find your balance in your work life. Find your balance in relationship to cannabis or any plant medicine.
Oh, you hit it nail on the head. Again, it's like, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, it's like not letting the one bad apple ruin it for everyone, right? Like, there is always going to be someone or something that does something, quote unquote, in a way that I don't like to use duality terms, but is wrong, right? Or let's put it in less of a duality term, like less than ideal, put it that way, right? But at the end of the day, we don't always throw the baby out with the bathwater with everything, right? Like, for instance, like they made gum for a long time with aspartame, right? They still do, right? And that didn't when we figured out or started to figure out how, challenging aspartame can be, it's not like they stopped making gum and were like, never again. They were like, how do we improve this? Right. So again, now that we've been aware of like, oh, this beautiful plant called cannabis has had 80 to 100 years of stigmatization and all of these things that, again, the plant didn't do any of that. And now that the science is coming out, we get to make more well-informed choices, right? And wield the power of discernment, right? Because with great power comes great responsibility. And that's what I tell everyone with cannabis and psilocybin and all these plant medicines. There is great power there. And so it's up to you to provide the responsibility, right? To understand and be able to be okay and discern with like, how often is correct for me, right? Also, if I'm feeling shame and guilt, where the hell did I learn that from? Because I know that nothing in the universe is objective.
That topic you just brought up of the shame and the guilt, Like the bubble gum is a perfect analogy because we all chewed bubble gum our whole life as a child, a teenager, probably in our adult years, and we never once felt guilty for it. Why? Because we didn't have a label in our mind that it was bad. Mm-hmm. But it was bad, right? It was filled with aspartame, and it was actually, causing some kind of health detriment. We were none the wiser, right? Why? We were innocent to that label. And that's the archetypal story of Adam and Eve in the garden of original sin. The original sin in that story is actually the labeling of reality, assigning reality a mental meaning rather than just being in that naked, childlike, innocent experience of reality without labels. That's the non-dual state. And labeling introduces duality. And so what does the snake say to Eve? The snake says, oh, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of that tree, you'll be like God. So the snake is implying you're not already like God. You're separate from God, and this act will make you one with God. So that was the original sin of introducing the idea that we are separate or other than the divine. And so from that position, all we can do, because once we believe we're separate, we have to then see a whole universe of separation. And then in a universe of separation, you better know what everything is, because everything's a threat. Everything could potentially be your downfall, right? So the mind quickly goes to work labeling everything to death. And we literally label the universe to death with mental ideas and labels, such that we are only ever referring to the label of something and never to the thing itself. And I was laughing the other day listening to Tom Segura's live special on his most recent one. I didn't honestly think much of it was funny, except for this one part where he talks about, where I'm going?
I believe I do.
Getting his mom high.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Because she always had this label that weed is bad, don't do drugs, da da da. And he had to like convince his mom that weed's not bad, that those labels you've heard are not true. Like, give it a shot. So she finally does an edible. And then she's like, whoa, this is really nice. And she's like, give me more. And she wants more edibles. And it goes on from there. I won't spoil it. It's really funny. But it shows you, right? Like she had a label that it was bad. But what was her childlike, innocent experience with it? She loved it. So the reality did not match the label, right, of cannabis. And so that's what we're doing with everything, with the bird, with the person, with the grass, with the leaves. Everything we label, we stop experiencing the aliveness and the sacredness of it in this present moment, that everything's this divine, magical performance and mystery that we can breathe it in, we can connect with it, we can feel it and be one with it. But if we have a label, we won't see it. And so that's where the shame and the guilt comes in, right? This is what I did all my life in Christianity, was I would commit a sin and then feel guilty about it. And what does God say to Adam and Eve when he notices that they're hiding? He says, who told you that you were naked? Meaning, who labeled you naked? Right? You didn't know you were naked until someone told you with a label, and then you made that wrong. So again, that's why I say the labeling of plant medicines is really the whole downfall of anyone's difficult relationship with it that creates addiction or creates aversion. Either way, it's because you've labeled it as something. Because if you had that Garden of Eden, innocent, labelless relationship to cannabis, it would just be something like anything else. You would chew the bubble gum without ever thinking it was wrong or bad to do so. You would smoke the cannabis without ever thinking it was bad or wrong to do so. And then if you did get into an unhealthy relationship with it, because you're not all tabooizing it, you'd just be able to notice that. Oh, I'm doing a little too much. It's getting a little bit excessive. It's interfering with my love life or family life or whatever. You would just see those things. But as soon as a taboo is introduced to something, I know this very well from religion, it makes it impossible to transcend until you release it, because it creates so much shame and guilt. And that suppression of shame and guilt, as you know, what you fight, you strengthen, what you suppress persists. And so you've got to get the guilt and the taboo off of something before you can transcend it. And I think that's why in AA, the first thing they do is they make it not taboo to acknowledge that, yeah, I'm addicted to alcohol. And that's the first liberation the alcoholic actually gets.
Absolutely. I mean, dude, this is so powerful, because I always look at like, what is the root cause of the root cause, right? Like, let's go deep, because the idea is not to have shame and guilt, but like for instance, like if you're carrying around a backpack full of cement, is the idea to shame yourself of why your backpack seems noticeably heavier than everyone else's? At what point do you just go, all right, I'm going to put the backpack down, see what's in it, and discern if that's still correct for me. And then I can figure out if I want to create space in there to put things that are even more in alignment with me in there now, right? Like, so I tell everyone, you're not going to get anywhere from just feeling bad over yourself. Like, I understand and I empathize, but like, let's get curious, right? Like if we're here to be the best versions of ourselves and we choose to believe that everything is happening for us, then what can this challenge, such as cannabis dependency, or really what cannabis dependency is really going after, what can it show you? Because again, like cannabis dependency, alcohol addiction, any of these things, what are they really speaking to? It's not that you have a cannabis or alcohol or insert coping strategy here problem. You have a potential solution that is these coping strategies. Now, it's not a solution, and obviously every addict can figure that out. But what separates the addict that goes, okay, I'm going to stop this, with the addict that actually does not stop it, right? And for me, again, of course, it's multifaceted, but I really think it comes down to like an unconscious addiction to suffering, right? Because that's what we've learned from separation and all of these things. A lot of us believe, like, I mean, here in Boston, right? One of the most typical sayings people say? Hey, how you doing? Oh, life sucks, then you die. And they laugh about it, right? And I used to be one of these people. So like I'm talking from like, and I'm laughing from personal experience, like that is spelling yourself, right? And so again, it's with great power comes great responsibility, right? Plant medicines are very powerful. Our words are very powerful. The stories we create and tell ourselves about ourselves from those words are very powerful. How we then emulate.
Dude, we should make a new saying. We should make a new saying in Boston where you say life is bliss and then you reincarnate.
Dude, let's go. We got to trademark that, man. That'll be a Boston special.
How much more cutting edge is that, honestly?
Dude, you know how weird people would be like, huh? What? Like, because like here in Boston, like, what's funny is, when you go to Austin or San Diego or any of these kind of spiritual hubs, you see a lot of it. But when you dive in, you realize like, hey, a lot of people have the best of intentions. They're just still like falling victim to a lot of the same things you see more presented here in maybe Boston. But here people are more raw with it. This is what I've noticed. Like they just kind of are like, yeah, I don't fucking get it. Like, you know what I mean? Like they don't fucking get it. But when you actually like,
you're like, yeah, it's just this endless cyclone of bliss and perfection, brother.
Exactly. Hop on the train.
Isn't it crazy?
Water's warm, But it is interesting, that dichotomy, and it's very interesting. But I'm curious for you, man. Like, with regards to cannabis and all the things we've been talking about, like, what are some of your practical tips for maybe someone who's listening to this and going, oh, I resonate so hard, right? Like, I know a lot of people, like, put it this way, right? I know a lot of people listen to an episode and they go, there's new things I must go do, right? What is your personal wisdom when it comes to, like, let's say someone who listens to this episode and they're like, I'm going to go start doing this and doing that, right? Like, what would you say with regards to that, right? Like whether or not, again, I don't know if I want to give you too much direction in terms of like the person that feels shame and guilt around not doing enough or whatever, just like, what would you give in terms of wisdom to the person who listens to this and wants to know what to do next?
Well, I talk about this question quite a bit in 40 University. We have a lot of our students often will get on the Q&As and be like, hey, I'm just like going through this addiction to cigarettes or cannabis or alcohol. I just always got to have a drink at the end of the night and I feel horribly guilty and I know it's halting my spiritual progress. And I try to give them a nice reframe of like, how do you know it's halting your spiritual progress? How do you know it's not a sign of your spiritual progress? Because it's like, haven't you always had an addiction to something? Like, well, yeah, totally. Now that you mention it. Like, right. But now you're finally noticing it. So clearly you are progressing in self-awareness. But now it's just like, how do we use this as a teaching device? Because I don't think total renunciation is always the right way. It may be the right way for some people. But a lot of times, if you just try to completely shun something with the, what's the yoga, the complete giving up of worldly attachments and like living only in an ashram, never leaving and just devoting all your life to meditation. Part of you is kind of saying like, wow, the pleasures of the world are so great and enticing that I must distance myself a great, great far distance to not get sucked into them. It's like you're still believing in the illusion, right? Yeah. That it is so great and you have to deny it because you're supposed to go for God instead of worldly pleasures. So you got to see through that paradox, right? That you're not actually escaping anything. And for me, one of the core principal teachings that I cover in the 40 University curriculum is called the 3 beliefs of ego. And it really spells out why we have addictions and cravings, and especially like the energetics of the chakras and where they come from. In that the three beliefs of ego are the three lower chakras, and those correlate to the emotions of sadness, anger, and fear. These are the only three negative emotions we really suffer from. There's many variations of each three of those. With sadness, there's depression and hopelessness and loneliness and grief and whatnot. With anger, there's frustration, annoyance, jealousy, rage, irritation. With fear, there's anxiety, paranoia, stress, worry. But all of these are just different variations of these three root emotions. And they correlate to the lower three chakras. And that's because each one of those three emotions is actually signaling a different belief that's underlying that emotion, that's happening in your mind. The emotions are a response to your thinking. And so in that way, I like to call them the emotional guidance system. Because if I think a thought that feels bad, if I feel a negative emotion, the emotions are saying that thought isn't true. That's why it feels bad. Because what feels good is what's true and natural and inherent to us. So if I feel positive, I must be thinking according to reality. So when I get a nice car, for example, I feel very abundant, right? The car to me is just a symbol of my abundance. And the universe says, yes, you are abundant. That is true. And I feel this joyful feeling. The universe isn't telling me that the car possesses my abundance. It's just, how do I perceive myself in this moment? Abundant. Yes, joy is the result. But likewise, if I perceive myself as lacking, then sadness is the result. That's the first belief of ego, is lack. I am incomplete. Something about me is fundamentally missing, inadequate, unworthy, whatever word you want to use. And from there flows the second belief. So from the root chakra up to the sacral chakra, which the sacral chakra, as we know, is like the personal chakra, the personal sense of self, how I think and feel about myself as an independent being. And so that creates the second belief, which is that essentially my happiness as an individual depends upon external outcomes. Because if I'm lacking, then I must be able to fulfill that lack somehow. And how am I going to fulfill my lack? Well, I'm going to go gain good outcomes in the world. I'm going to go get pleasure from the world. And then I'll feel completed inside. So that's the second belief. And that's the belief that causes addiction. We won't go into the third belief now because that's as far as we need to go, is that if you believe your happiness is dependent on an external thing, then you have to chase that thing. And that's what addiction is, right? And so where we kid ourselves is that we try to say on the spiritual path, oh, smoking can't make me happy or drinking can't make me happy. All I want is God. And it's like, that's kind of not true though, right? Because you do find happiness in the cigarette, in the cannabis, in the alcohol, whatever the addiction is, sex, you do find pleasure in it. That's why you're doing it. So what if you acknowledge that and just acknowledge that it is pleasurable, it's just fleeting and not lasting. It will always disappear as soon as it appears. Very quickly, arises and falls just like that. That's the honest truth. Now we're telling the truth. Feels really good for a little bit, and then it wears off and I'm back to my default state of consciousness. So now the question is, what kind of happiness do I want? Do I want the fleeting, momentary, temporary happiness that comes from chasing outcomes in the world? Money, sex, fame, fortune. I got to always be chasing the next outcome. And as soon as I get it, I barely have time to enjoy it before the ego cracks the whip and I'm off chasing the next outcome for my master, right? That's the reality of addiction. So you got to see it for what it is. And if we use the renunciate, overly spiritual approach sometimes, we're kind of bypassing in a way that it's like, hey, you know what's way more cutting edge than running away from your addiction is mastering it. That's just my feeling.
Dude, I mean, that was one of the, if not the best explanation of addiction I've ever heard, because it's practical, right? It's not bypassing, like you said. The fact that, like, of course, like, if you're going to use cannabis, or you're going to use nicotine or alcohol or cocaine or whatever, it's going to give you that feeling of happiness. And what I really like about happiness versus joy is one of the mystery schools I've been a part of, they had a great saying. They were like, happiness is kind of like ghetto joy, right? And I loved that. Like, I just thought it was hilarious. Because they were saying joy is our innate state of being as human beings when we're in wholeness, right? Like, we're in this constant state of joy. Very similar to if you see an infant or like even a kid that's, doesn't have a rational mind formed yet, they're going to be in a state of joy, which looks like a lot of things, right? And then they might have an emotion come up where they go into a tantrum, and then they haven't been told yet that certain emotions are desirable or acceptable or undesirable, unacceptable.
They don't censor themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So they just fucking feel it. And then eventually, usually within 10 or 12 minutes, that emotion's gone and they're back to joy, right? So like, I think that's one of the best teachings children have to teach us. But anyway, it's like when we think about the things that these things can provide, if we are feeling that state of lack, right, we're closed off to joy, then we are going to seek out, let's say, that fleeting feeling that feels similar. It's like a distant cousin, but it's going to disempower us the more we do it into thinking we can't do this ourselves. We need it this way, right? And you throw the shame and guilt on top of that, and it's just this weird recipe for awkwardness, So I'm really glad you brought it up that way. It's extremely pertinent.
Are you familiar with Ramana Maharshi?
Sounds familiar, but remind me where I may have heard that name from before.
He's the sage, Ramana Maharshi, who's known for developing the practice of self-inquiry. Do you know who Muji is?
I've heard of Muji before. Again, I'm not exactly sure where, but I've definitely heard that name before.
Yeah. So Muji's guru was Papaji. Papaji's guru was Ramana Maharshi. He's probably the most famous of all Indian sages in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, probably undoubtedly is. And he had an amazing response to one questioner in one of the Talks with Ramana Maharshi books I've read, where they said something like, why do we feel bliss with drugs and stuff? Like, you talk about the bliss of the self all the time, that Ramana Maharshi was always in this state of oneness with the God self and was offering that this is available to all. And then some questioners would say, well, then why do drugs feel so good? Are you saying that self-realization makes you feel like you're high all the time or something? And Ramana Maharshi said, whenever you take a substance, whether it's alcohol or tobacco or cannabis, anything that makes you feel genuinely blissful, it's because the drug has an effect, some kind of chemical effect on the brain that either quiets or mutes the ego completely for a short period of time. And like with tobacco, for example, it's like that quick come up, that rush, when the tobacco really hits the nervous system. It's like it goes like this to the ego and then takes the hand off. And so for those 10, 20 seconds where the rush of the high is coming up, you have the full body high. It feels really good. And you're just like, bliss. And you'll actually feel the heart chakra a lot of times activating, and you feel this love for creation. And then it wears down really quick. So the half-life is really sharp for tobacco. Whereas cannabis, it's a little longer and goes like that. But Ramana Maharshi said, whatever the drug or substance is, whatever the experience is, it's causing the mind to temporarily plunge into the heart, and the ego is silenced. And in that silencing of the ego, you experience the bliss of your true nature. So the drug isn't giving you bliss. It's not giving you anything you don't have. It's clearing the obstructions temporarily from what you could always be feeling. And maybe with certain drugs, because they have that prana enhancement feeling, the physical felt sensation of the bliss is a bit more charged up than it would be in a like enlightened non-dual state. But the underlying background of absolute surrender and peace and love for life is always there, whether or not you're on a substance. And that I can attest to for myself from having that 2-week experience. And then over the next 4 or 5 years, just passionately pursuing how to return to that state. It feels very different to me now than it did 5 years ago in that 2-week glimpse, or when I would smoke cannabis to get into that state. Because back then it was totally novel to me and I had no reference frame for it, no relationship to it yet. So it kind of blew the doors off everything I thought was possible. And so the experience of bliss was like super, super high. But as we gradually access that state on a permanent basis by quieting the mind, quieting the nervous system through meditation and a healthy diet and spiritual practice, the mind becomes quieter and quieter. And we notice that there is a background of bliss there all the time, and no experience any longer removes it. Experiences may seem to overshadow it temporarily, but as soon as I can get back to baseline, like if an intruder barged into my house and I was in a normal kind of state of peace, you can better believe my primal instincts would turn on. I would feel the energy in the body and I'd rush to do something about it. And there may be like a felt primal fear going on to compel me to action. All valid, all not unspiritual in any way. And then as soon as that experience was over and taken care of, that state of peace would be right there waiting for me, right? Because it's now my default state because I've removed all the obstructions in its place. And for me, those obstructions really were the three beliefs of ego, which again are lack, the belief in lack, attachment to outcomes. And the third one is basically the belief that I'm in control of life. I'm in control of life and I make life work in my favor is the third belief. And when you can really master those and transcend your belief in them, the ego has no more grip on your consciousness any longer. And whether or not you have an addiction or whether it's cannabis or something else, you'll find that balance comes naturally. Once you're able to integrate a true peaceful state of consciousness, you won't feel a need to get high anymore. You won't feel a dependency on a substance to feel peace anymore. But even then, it doesn't mean that you may not still use it because, again, it's a tool that can be used like anything else. And if you were leading a ceremony or something, like you may find it very useful to get into a even deeper state of alertness and attention through cannabis or tobacco. So again, in the kingdom of heaven, everything is valid and childlike and innocent when we take the labels off of it. And if you can do that with cannabis, you'll do it with everything else too, truly. Like if you can do that with a substance that you feel addicted to and make it not taboo, you'll be able to forgive yourself for cursing someone out in your mind in traffic or being selfish. You'd be like, oh, that's okay. That was just ego. I forgive myself. The way you are with one thing is the way you are with everything, right? So there again is another way cannabis can teach.
Dude, at the end of the day, what I've always thought of is we don't know what we don't know, right? And wise is the man who knows he does not know, or woman, right? For you women out there. But,
yes,
again, it's like, if we understand that, then how would we ever know that, like, for instance, like, I can feel this state of bliss, but I might still be curious. I think it's human nature, right? Like again, I'm not a religious person, but I know a good line when I hear it. The Bible states, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must first enter the mind of a child. Well, what is a child if not anything else? Curious. They are curious.
Yep.
You tell them don't touch the hot stove. They're like, well, I'm going to touch it anyway because I don't know how hot it is, right? So again, I think it's in human nature to be curious, to want to experience things. And why would I ever take something off of the buffet just because someone else told me that thing is not good, right? Like I'm going to use discernment to be able to dive into the entire buffet of life and be able to, like, again, there's some things like heroin, I don't really need to test that to figure out that's probably not going to lead to anything good, right? But
right.
with a lot of these things, it's like, how do I know that, right? And I love what you were saying about the ability of people to like want that bliss over and over again. Because if we think about just for a second, right, like how far away from true human nature we are, and I'm not saying go back to living in caves, right? I'm not a fan of that, but let's just be aware of it, right? Like it's never been harder to regulate your nervous system than living in the modern day world. Now, albeit I'm super excited to live in the modern day world. I love technology. I love being able to do this, but it does demand
have its challenges.
Yeah, exactly. It does demand a little bit more awareness around nervous system regulation, things like that. So I think for most of us, we've been trained to, like, let's say we're holding a snow globe in our hand, right? And let's say that, like, it's a little hard to say who'd be holding the snow globe, but let's just say our divine self is holding the snow globe, but it's also being influenced by the picture it's looking at, right? And it's been told that the way in which to view the snow globe and use the snow globe and benefit from the snow globe is to shake it up as much as you can, right? And it's cool when you're shaking it up. There's snow everywhere and blah, 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 blah. But what do you miss out when it's constantly being shaken up? You don't see the image in there, right? Like there's no image you can actually see. And I think that's where I know for me personally, I was at for a long time and how I view this state of bliss that's in the background, right? It's subtle, right? And you need wisdom to be able to understand that, like, actually looking at the picture is pretty cool, And like, hey, that doesn't mean that every once in a while you can't give it a good shake, right? Or, connect with cannabis or even go out and have some drinks if that's your thing, right? But like, it just, can you remember the picture behind there also, right? And there's a book, I don't know if you've ever read it, Way of the Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman. Have you ever read that book?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Dude, it's a great like depiction of this. So in this book, basically this guy who's going to UCLA, I think, or something, or Berkeley, something like that. He's a track star. And he meets this guy at a gas station one night who works at the gas station. He nicknames this guy Socrates. Super like he can just tell, like the guy was like down there and then he's on the roof in like 3 seconds. This guy's weird. So he's like, I want to learn from him. So basically the first, like, let's say year of this guy's training is like, you got to get on a vegan diet. You got to stop having sex, right? You got to like do all these things, right? And Dan
renounce everything.
Exactly. And Dan's like, you know, kind of like, man, fuck this guy, you know, like, just like, you know, you're telling me I can't do any of this stuff. Like, all right, fine.
Taking away all my treaties.
Yeah, exactly. And then, as you know, right, like, you know, what started to happen in Dan is then he started to form an identity around like, no, I don't eat meat. No, I don't do this. I don't do that. I would never do. I'm a spiritual person, right? Now, Socrates knew this would happen. So one night, Dan goes to see him at the gas station, and Socrates is talking to him, asking him how things are going. And then he pulls out a pack of cigarettes. He's like, hey, you want one? And Dan's like, what? Like, what? You just gave me all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. He's like, well, we're going to go get some drinks after this too. And he's like, are you kidding me? I just spent the last year, blah, 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 right? So Socrates educates him like, Dan, there are no such thing as a bad action, just bad habits, right? It's kind of like the whole idea of it, you know? So it's
bad intentions.
Exactly. Bad intentions. So when you were talking about that, it reminded me of that. It's really fucking cool stuff, you know?
That's so great, man. That's such a great analogy. And, another great one is you mentioned the snow globe. A similar one is the idea of a diamond covered with mud.
Yeah.
In that whatever spiritual practice we're using will eventually have to be laid aside and be transcended, because the truth is we are already the divine. We are already the Buddha, the Christ. It's already our nature. Bliss is already our nature. It's just covered up with a bunch of junk, right? Ego noise. And that's what the mud around the diamond represents. The diamond doesn't become a diamond when it's finally cleaned off. It's just that the diamond is revealed. So the idea that whether it's a meditation or a yoga practice or something, that we sit down to practice and we're progressing closer to enlightenment. We're being on a journey, right? That's putting us back in the ego's position. I'm a separate self trying to get there. And you can have addictions from that place, even well into your spiritual path. You can still struggle with substance abuse because everything you're doing is reinforcing this idea of separation. And so that's why removing the labels and the taboos about things and seeing everything like a child, like you're just chewing the bubble gum, even though you don't know it has aspartame in it, you're just not making it wrong anymore. Yeah. Then you actually start to enter the kingdom of heaven Jesus talked about as a little child, where everything is valid. The kingdom of heaven, or if you want to say God's reality, does not judge right or wrong. In fact, the law of one even says this, that the creator doesn't blink an eye at the light or the darkness. It doesn't see one is good and one is bad. So, hey, if a soul wants to choose the darkness, you're absolutely welcome to. The universe will honor you and allow you to have that choice just as much as the light. That's unconditional love, right? And so when we see that, then you can't make anything guilty anymore. You're allowed to be addicted to stuff. It's just about, is it what you really want? Is it what you're really looking for? Or are you fooling yourself, right? The addiction will never satisfy you if within you there's a God desire to experience oneness and live in that state of divine union. Then guess what? Only that will provide you with that fulfillment. So the substance can be a great teacher on your path, just like meditation can be, or yoga, or any spiritual practice. But eventually all practices have to be laid aside. And we just have to begin accepting what is true. I am the Buddha already. I am the Christ. Nothing about me ever changes. I'm just experiencing this character temporarily as a learning device. It's part of my evolutionary journey, but I am one with God already. Nothing I do in this life will change that. Then we can have freedom and give ourselves freedom to, like the guru in the story you mentioned, smoke a pack of cigarettes or something without the guilt. I mean, Nisargadatta is one of the most famous gurus of all time. And he was famous for smoking cigarettes constantly because along his enlightenment path, he rolled and made cigarettes as his day job in India. And he was a cigarette addict. And in like 3 years, he met his guru and became enlightened. And he didn't have time, let's say, to dissolve the karma of the addiction yet. And so he's basically, when people would ask him like, hey, you're this enlightened guru and you say you know reality, but you're smoking cigarettes all the time. He'd be like, yeah, so what? It's just my body's addiction. It's not me. And he had such a distinction between the body and the true self, right? He wasn't identified with the body. So he's like, I just let the addiction go on. What do I care? And like, he didn't even care to keep his body, to preserve his body's life anymore. Because he's like, I'm an eternal being. I don't care what happens to the body. And that was his view of enlightenment. So you just see that we can't pigeonhole the universe into any one view of something that, oh, all true sages and avatars are celibates. They don't have a wife. They don't smoke, don't do drugs, don't ever drink alcohol. That very much may not be the case. And we'll overlook many sages that way, right? If we have those labels.
Definitely. Dude, I love that. That is like actually really comical. Like, just like very nonchalant, like, no, it's just my body's thing. I'm not worried about that. It's like that.
It's not my addiction. Yeah. It's the body's addiction. Yeah. Don't blame me.
I would have loved to see the face of people that asked him, like, so you're this guru and you just smoke cigarettes? He's like, yeah, it's just my body's addiction. Like, I don't know what they would rebut to that, but I would pay to see that,
he would literally say the body smokes cigarettes, not me.
That is
That
wild.
was how deep his awareness was,
Wow. It's funny too, because, this would probably be another whole hour-long topic, but we didn't even get into the idea of like diet within this matrix as well, right? You mentioned before we hit record too about being a vegetarian for a while. There's like this unconscious / potentially very conscious, depending on what circles are in, kind of thing of like, you're spiritual and you still eat meat. I'm like, dude, like it is pretty wild to me. Like, again, everyone's physiology is going to be different.
You're spiritual and you still judge people?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like you're still seeing that like these things are, going to be judgments for people. Like it's pretty crazy, And again, how we do anything is how we do everything. So I can have compassion knowing when I was in states of consciousness and when I slip into them, when I judge people, cut me off or whatever like that. But like you were saying, I can also laugh at that and give myself grace and realize like, oh, like, that's also part of me that I love, right? That part of me that wants to protect me, thinks I've been wronged, but I can see a more overarching objective view and realize like I'm choosing to not believe I was wronged in this situation because maybe that person just needed to get ahead of me in traffic. Like I don't know objectively. Yeah. And so what is the most positive outcome that I can project to make this situation happen for me so that I don't go to bed metaphorically or figuratively with hate or distaste in my mouth, And I think that's overall like that really allowed me to start. And again, by no means am I perfect at it, but that allowed me to start being like genuinely grateful around the tests I get in life, right? Like when I get like, and of course, like getting cut off, I'm like, oh, I can be thankful about that. More big things, like obviously that does take a lot of practice to get used to, but again, the time's going to go by anyway, right? Like we're here anyway. We might as well just get good at it, So that's amazing, man. Aaron, this has been amazing, brother. I can't wait to have you back on. We got through such a beautiful conversation around shame and guilt around plant medicines. And I really feel like for 99.999, I would be careful to even say 100%, right, of the people that listen to this podcast, guys and girls also that are listening, realize that like, these are the things that all of us must transcend ourselves, right? This shame and guilt that we've been given around the choices we make in life. But also we now hold some of the keys that we can potentially liberate those close to us if they are choosing to ask us those questions, right? I always recommend waiting for the invitation. I did that for a long time of just trying to put things on people. I know it'll help you, right? but at the end of the day, like, please guys, like, make sure that you're taking this information. And if you're excited about it and people around you are excited about it, share it, And so Aaron, where can people find you? Where can they find out more about 4D University? All the amazing things you're putting out. We're going to link it all in the show notes. I'll also put some things in there about the rabbit hole series you did with Jay Griff. We didn't even get into any of that stuff. That's why I think we need a round 2 to dive into the psychedelic nature of reality. But where can I send people to find you, connect with you, and stay up to date on everything you're doing?
Yeah, very easy. It's 4duniversity.com if you want to learn more about my program there. And then youtube.com/Aaron Abke if you want to either get familiar with my content or teachings or dive into some of the things I was mentioning on today's call, like the 3 beliefs of ego and spiritual intelligence. You'll find all that content on youtube.com/Aaron Abke. And similarly, Aaron Abke on Instagram or TikTok.
Beautiful. And guys, I'm telling you, like, there's a couple people I've met over the past 2 years, that'd be like you and Jeremy, really, that just were like magnetic pulls. Like, I'm not saying that I'm some guru and should know who you should follow, guys, but I'm telling you, Aaron speaks the truth, and it's in very practical terms, right? Like, you don't need to be an advanced spiritual yogi who's been on the top of a mountain for 20 years to understand and be able to articulate these things, that he's talking about. And also, you can go super fucking deep with what he says too. So it's not like it's like basic and you can't go farther. Like, it is just very practical and very well articulated. And Aaron, I have one last question for you, man. And that question is this. I ask everyone this question, right? So let's say someone listens to this episode and they're extremely excited to look into the idea of psychedelic medicines in their own life. What is the one piece of advice that you would suggest to them to be able to allow them to use proper discernment in choosing whether or not psychedelics are right for them in their life?
Very great question. Yeah, I guess I would summarize everything we've said so far. You're familiar with Ram Dass, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So Ram Dass's guru was Neem Karoli Baba, or Maharaji. And he had this famous quote when he discussed plant medicines with Ram Dass in India. They brought him a bunch of LSD, as you know, that you probably know the famous story. And he says he took it and nothing happened. And they ask him, why did nothing happen? Why didn't you trip out and go crazy like we do when we do LSD? And the answer was essentially like, you don't have to take a drug to go somewhere you always are already. He was always in that state that drugs take you to. And he said, our people have known about these substances for thousands of years, mushrooms especially, and have taken these substances to experience the divine. And he said, they are very good medicines. He called them medicines. They're very good medicines. He says, they bring you into the room with Christ, but you cannot stay. Meaning you will get kicked out of the room eventually. And so again, as we said, you have to use that state you can access on a plant medicine of that oneness, that peace, that presence with life, and say, okay, that's what it feels like. Now I have the experience. Now let me always practice being in that state and integrate the psychedelic state as a natural state. And so to do that, I think you have to always look at your intention of why you're using. And we mentioned that earlier, but if you get the urge to smoke some cannabis, right? Don't just mindlessly spark up the joint and smoke it. It's always a good thing in a sense to do what you feel like doing, what you're called or inspired to do, but make that desire a pure intention, meaning, okay, I want to smoke a joint tonight or a volcano bag or however you do it. So I'm going to do that, but let me connect first with the plant and thank it for the medicine it's going to provide. And let me set my intention for why I'm doing it. And that's a twofold practice because one, you're not using it now as an escape device or a substance to be abused. You're mindful of not doing that while also adding an intention that you're kind of speaking to the plant medicine. And you'll see you can very much be in relationship to these plant medicines when you cultivate an intention with them of like I mentioned earlier, I want to work on this part of myself tonight. I feel something coming up or stirring in me. Let's bring this up tonight and work on it. Or I want to have a divine connection with God tonight. I'm going to watch a documentary about the universe and just go deep into the nature of reality and just experience God in the psychedelic way that cannabis only can do. That's also just as valid, right? Your intention is what makes the desire pure. There is no inherently pure or impure desire, right? Intention makes it so. So if you're using intention with the plant medicine, you're going to get the right results that you're looking for.
Oh, I absolutely love that, man. And, it's funny, I'll say real quick, guys, I'm sure no one listening to this show is probably that I don't know if he's accurate with that. But when I talk about cannabis being a spiritual aid and ally, I'm not just talking about that figuratively. I literally mean, like Aaron was just saying, there is actually an energy, a frequency, whatever you want to call the spirit. Exactly, a consciousness to that plant. Yeah. And you can be in relationship with that plant the same way that you relate to other individuals, right? Of course, it's different than
water.
Yeah, exactly. You relate to anything, right? So, it's a real thing. And, again, I always tell everyone, don't believe anything we say, right? Test it out for yourself, see what happens, And so I absolutely love that. Mm-hmm. And guys, as I stated in the show, from the first time I heard Aaron speak, I resonated deeply with him. And I am sure after hearing this deep dive between the two of us, that each of you can see why I was so excited to have the opportunity to get him onto the show and spread his teachings and love with each of you. For any of you looking to learn more about 4D University and stay up to date on all of the amazing projects, teachings, and content Aaron is creating in the world, make sure to dive into the show notes for this episode, where I will be laying out all of the ways to which to find him on social media and ensure you don't miss out on anything he puts out. Aaron, thank you so much for sharing your time, wisdom, and expertise with the listeners and me on the show today, for devoting yourself to the important work you are doing to bring practicality and understanding to the realms of spiritual intelligence, non-duality, and enlightenment as a whole, and for being such a bright light for the world to charge its battery off of. And until next time, my brother, may your journey be smooth and full of light. Aho.